Welcome back everybody to another Motobot video, and today BMW unveiled this stunning new concept bike that really does mark a potential change in direction for their cruiser lineup. You see, up to now, their R18 has been more focused on the traditional, easygoing touring vibe with classic looks and plenty of heft. But this, the R20, looks leaner, meaner, sportier, and it should have more power, as you may have guessed from the name. But is it really possible to just convert a cruise liner into a speedboat? And can it really go up against some of the already brilliant performance cruisers on the market like the Triumph Rocket 3 or the Ducati Diavel V4 or even the Harley Breakout? Well, in this video, we'll go over everything that we know about it so far to find out. Now, the first indication that it's a much more performance-orientated machine than the regular R18 comes from all the chassis changes that make it look like a bike that's really built to handle. So instead of that super long stance with the raked-out fork and the big 19-inch front wheel and a squat little 16 at the rear for that custom cruiser look, this, the R20, rolls on 17 inches front and rear, and you can see from the pictures it's significantly shorter, which really should quicken up the handling. In fact, they do give some specs on this, so the wheelbase is 1,550 millimeters and the steering head angle is 62.5 degrees, so that's a lot shorter than the 1,731 millimeter wheelbase of the standard R18 and also much steeper than the 57.3 degrees steering angle. So yes, expect a lot more agility and flickability, and also that smaller front wheel is going to help a lot with that too. Now, front and rear, you've also got top spec Öhlins Blackline suspension, which is a big step up from the more basic fork and shock with the traditional look that you'll get on the R18s. And while this is, it is a prototype, so you might not get something so bling on a final production version, it's still a big indication that this is going to be a much more sporty bike. Brakes look pretty flippin' beefy too. They're from ISR with a properly massive 6-pot radially mounted front caliper, and they say that's going to help with really quite quick deceleration for what is realistically going to be still a fairly weighty bike. I mean, it is slimmed down a little bit, but fully fueled, the R18, even in the most stripped back standard version, is 345 kilograms wet. So even if they do pare this one back still further, realistically, I think you're still looking at the best part of 300 kilograms. Now, one of the most interesting features on this bike has to be the new swing arm, which does still take a bit of inspiration from the R18 with that open drive shaft, which I think looks really cool, but it's modernized a bit and enhanced with their signature paralever design, which in this case is made part from steel and part from aluminium. Now, the general idea for anyone who's not familiar with a paralever swing arm is that it eliminates the effects of shaft jacking, easy, and that is where the back end of the bike jacks up under acceleration, which maybe wasn't a particularly big problem for the R18 with it being so long and relatively chilled out. But look, for a shorter and presumably more powerful incarnation, the paralever might well be a necessity for a more pleasant ride. In fact, in BMW's own words in their press release, they say the kinematics are designed so that the drive torque is completely balanced. I think also, though, as a side benefit, they've ended up with something that looks absolutely fantastic at the back end of this bike. You've got some nice technical detail on show, some nice machining as well, and so I think that's going to help distinguish it visually, as well as the big Boxer Twin, from the other power cruisers on the market, especially with that open shaft that I really do like. Anyway, what about this engine then? Well, obviously it's derived from the big Boxer, the engine they currently use in all their R18 variants, and as if 1,803 cc's of capacity wasn't already enough, and more than probably most cars now out on the road, they've found the way to boost this one still further, so this comes in at 2,000 cc, which of course leads to the R20 name. Now, I assume they've increased the bore to achieve this, and they also say there are new cylinder head covers, a new belt cover, and a new oil cooler, which is more hidden away up top and to me looks a lot neater. In fact, on the R18, I can't help but feel that it's probably a bit of a nightmare to keep clean down there behind the front wheel, and so perhaps this one would be better from a practical perspective too. Now they have said this is just a prototype, and you can tell that anyway from the air intakes and the 2x2 exhaust system, which are pretty much open and wouldn't get anywhere near passing current day homologation requirements. But still, with that extra capacity, you'd be expecting at least a bit of a step up in performance from the current R18s. In fact, those bikes really do get a low-end, torquey tune with just 91 horsepower made at 4,750 RPM, which doesn't sound like much for a 1.8 litre engine, but that's because the real shove is in the torque with the 158 Newton meters made down at 3,000 RPM, which really is very low. And having ridden the R18 plenty, we've reviewed most of the variants on this channel. You know, there is a proper gutsy stump pulling feel to the engine, and it's ideal really for that low and lazy power delivery that really does suit some of these big cruiser and tourer style bikes. The flip side though is that it does rev out pretty quickly, and that might not feel as appropriate for more of a power cruiser. And so hopefully this one gets a bit more top end. I guess boring it out could make the dimensions a little bit more conducive to some extra revs. Now for context, the Rocket 3 in the new 2024 Storm Edition makes a ridiculous 180 horsepower peak at 7,000 RPM, and so that means they'd need to almost double the current power of the R18 to get anywhere near it. And then there's 225 Newton meters of peak torque on tap down at 4,000 RPM. That's more than any other production motorcycle, and that's because it's got more capacity than any other production motorcycle at almost 2.5 liters. A ridiculous bike. The inline triple is just an absolute beast, and it basically feels like the character of something like a speed triple but with twice the grunt. Now the Ducati Diavo V4, which is another bike that you could say is part of the power cruiser segment, well, that gets a much smaller engine. It's about half the size of the Rocket 3, and so it makes far less torque, and it makes them at higher revs, so 126 Newton meters at 7,500 RPM. But thing is, being a V4, being a bit smaller in capacity as well, it revs much more freely, and so it makes a fairly competitive 168 horsepower up at 10,750 RPM. Plus, you've got to consider that it's a much more slender bike than the Rocket 3 at 223 kilograms unfueled, and so ultimately, if you wind it up, the superior power to weight ratio means it's actually the quicker of the two in a drag race. Something like the Harley Breakout 117 though is probably a much more achievable target for BMW. This bike makes a peak power figure of 102 horses at 5,020 RPM, and their peak torque figure of 168 Newton meters at 3,500 RPM isn't a million miles off either, so I'd be much more expecting the 2-litre big boxer engine to be in this sort of ballpark, and that'd be like a 10% enhancement-ish over the R18, which is, you know, proportionate to the increase in capacity. Now, the other area in which the Triumph and the Ducati excel versus the current R18s, and a lot of the Harley cruisers as well, would be with their sort of technology packages. They're basically on a par with most other modern sporty bikes, and you've got a TFT display on each, through which you can manage a whole suite of riding modes and rider aids, and you get connectivity features and all the good stuff like that. From the pictures here of the R20 concept, you can see it's sporting the mini TFT display, which was recently unveiled as an accessory fit for their R12 middleweight cruiser and the R1290 Retro Naked. So a little bit more modern and techy than the current R18s, and I tested both those bikes out recently, and I really did like this small dash accessory, especially for about 120 quid of an upgrade. It's really clear, easy to read, nicely laid out to make, you know, good use of the small amount of space, and also it helps the bike to look a bit custom and clean in the cockpit. If this bike does become a production model, I'd expect similar capabilities and features as well, and I'd expect a big hike versus the R18 in terms of rider aids and modes. We have to have a bit of a word on the styling though, because while I am a bit indifferent to the R18, you know, it looks okay, if not brilliant, but you know, for me, they've absolutely smashed this one. It's a brilliant looking bike, clean, muscular, nicely engineered, and I think it'd look right at home on a stand at a top-tier custom motorcycle show. The other thing as well is that I like that they've made some pretty bold choices too. You've got the hot pink fuel tank, the taillights integrated into the seat there, and perhaps most of all, the disc wheel at the rear with the big fat 200mm section rear tyre on it, and then also a more traditional spoked wheel at the front. So a bit mismatched, but I think it gives it even more of that custom look. The only thing I will say is perhaps don't, hold your breath for something that looks exactly like this in dealers in a year or two's time, because the original concept of the R18 looked crazy good as well. And then I think after that, some people were a little bit disappointed with the final production version because it just didn't have quite the same pizzazz. Things like the fishtail exhaust system on the concept look really cool. And then of course, because it had to be emissions compliant, the production version was just a bit more bulky and just didn't look as clean and custom style. And for me, I wouldn't necessarily say that's BMW's fault. Clearly, all of these homologation requirements are going to mean that a potential production R20 will look tamer and more cluttered with all the required bits and bobs, the indicators, the mirrors, the license plates, all that stuff. But look, ultimately, I try and be pretty positive on the channel, and so I'm still hoping that a real R20 would be a great looking bike because it still has this stunning prototype as a starting point. So if they do get something to market, well, what can you expect to pay for something of this nature? Well, a Rocket 3 now starts at £23,195 for the most basic R model. A Ducati Diavel V4 starts at £23,595, and a Harley Breakout 117 in the UK is £24,795. So I guess bad news for anyone who's hoping to snap up a bargain, and so the low £20,000 looks like the bare minimum, and BMWs do generally creep up quite quickly when you start delving into the accessories catalogue. Thing is though, realistically, this is always going to be a sort of halo product, something that has a bit of exclusivity and pride of ownership, and those things in the motorcycle business, and probably outside of it as well, rarely ever come cheap. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below. And also, the Diavel V4 is a great option in the meantime if you're looking for a really performance-orientated bike with a sort of semi-cruiser style riding position. And I loved riding it at the press launch last year, so do check out the video on the screen now in case you haven't seen it already. Also, do hit subscribe if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on YouTube. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next one.